A man is flying in a hot air balloon and he realizes he is hopelessly lost. He reduces his height. He spots a man below. He lowers the balloon farther and he shouts down, "Excuse me, can you tell me where I am?" And the man below says, "Well, you're in a hot air balloon and you're hovering 30 feet above this field." "You must be an engineer," says the balloonist. "Well, I am," says the man. "How did you know?" "Well," says the balloonist, "everything you've told me is technically correct, but it's of no use to anyone." And the man below says, "Well, you must be in management." "I am," replies the balloonist, "but how did you know?" "Well," says the man, "you don't know where you are, you don't know where you are going, but you expect me to help. You're in the same position that you were before we met, but now you've shifted the blame to me." I share that joke as sort of an introduction to not just what I'm going to be talking about today, but about what I'm going to be speaking on over the next 7 weeks. I'm going to be speaking on the nature of God. And as usual, I have to tell you, I'm just going to be scratching the surface of his nature. It would be so easy for me to give you all the facts and figures, just flood you with scriptures and leave it at that. But that would be the engineering approach. Engineers, please forgive me for that generalization. Or I could tell you what God is like based on my vision and experience, and then when I'm proven wrong, I'll just blame it on the theologian that I've been reading, the engineer, if you want to put it that way. That would be the management approach, and managers out there, please forgive me for that generalization. My hope is to be able to find some middle ground here, some practical application to what the Bible and what our experience tells us about God's nature, and then apply it to what we know to our lives as we move forward or we hold still in this social isolation. And there's a reason that I've chosen to go this direction for the next month and a half or so. And it all springs out of a question that has been asked of me several times over the past month and a half or so. Questions that probably have gone through your mind. And the question generally goes like this: if God is good, if God is all-powerful, why has he not put a stop to this pandemic of the COVID-19 virus? It's a great question. It is a fair question. And it is a question that if anyone rattles off a quick answer to, they really haven't thought it through or prayed much about it, because there is no quick and easy answer to such a question. And it's a question that has dogged people really since the beginning of time. And why? That's why Psalm 13 was shared with you. It is actually one of my favorite Psalms in the Bible. In it, King David wrestles with his questions and wrestles, frankly, with his anger with God. Listen to some of the words. "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death." David is genuinely ticked off. He just is. He's asking the same type of questions that many of us have been asking over the last 45 days. Now, I've shared with my congregation before that when I was a young Christian at age 23, I created a long list of questions that I wanted to ask God. And now, 40 years later, and actually April was my 40-year anniversary of believing in and trusting in Jesus, I still have a list, but it's gotten much, much shorter. And it's not because somehow I've received all the answers, because I have not. But as I've thought about it over the past several weeks, the list has gotten much shorter, partially because of my maturity. But it's mainly because as I've gotten older, I just have this growing trust in God and in his nature through my life experience. A deepening trust in who he is and how he is, And I've found that to be a far better approach to questions like, if God is so good and powerful, why has he not put a stop to this pandemic of this virus? That's a far better solution than coming up with some sort of pat answer that would only be inches deep and ultimately unsatisfactory. Oh, there are some answers out there, but they really depend on this ultimate knowledge of who and what God is. And my hope is that as we understand God a little bit deeper, our trust continues to grow. At least that's what I have experienced in my life. And now a bit of a warning, I've got to give you this. My background of a truly reformed theological understanding is going to be on full display, especially today. Why? Because I need to have this grounding point as a basic percept here. God is God. We are not. God is going to do what God is going to do. And if you want to know what he's going to do, what he likes, what he dislikes, read your Bible. As many of you know, both Susie and I have been seeing a certain foot doctor in our community, to the extent that he's done a couple of surgeries on Susie and one on me. And we've really grown to like and deeply appreciate this man. And we've learned to listen very carefully to what he tells us. Like last fall, when I knew something was desperately wrong with my foot, he explained that, well, we could cast it up for a little while and see if it settles down. But then he leaned forward to me and said, but I can fix this. And I didn't hesitate much in setting up a surgery date, and indeed he did fix it. Now when I see him, I simply call him the boss, because he knows what he is doing and he is in charge. The very same goes for God. I don't mean to imply that a particular doctor is God, not at all. God is God. We are not. God will do what he will do. God is in charge. God is the boss. My apologies to both the foot doctor and, I guess, to Bruce Springsteen. The the engineering understanding term for what God is sovereign. In English, the word sovereign gets defined as a ruler with unlimited power, the chief or the greatest, or an independent. The concept of the sovereign, that is a ruler with absolute authority who answers to no one, is very unfamiliar to most Americans. We may hear of a dictator or a strong man who has sovereign-like powers, but that is actually a far cry from the historical definition of a sovereign. In history, a sovereign was a ruler who had absolute authority and who really had that right to that authority, usually by heredity, and other times by conquest. But even the true sovereigns of history were only a pale reflection of the sovereignty of God. In the Bible, the word sovereign implies that there's absolutely nothing that happens in the universe that is outside of God's influence and authority. As King of Kings and Lord of Lords, God has no limitations. And let me be honest with you, there's no other Christian doctrine that gets more hotly debated and maybe more hated than this one. John MacArthur, who is really big on the sovereignty of God, writes this: no doctrine is despised by the natural mind more than the truth that God is absolutely sovereign. Human pride loathes the suggestion that God orders everything, controls everything, rules over everything. The carnal mind, he writes, burning with enmity against God, abhors the biblical teaching that nothing comes to pass except according to his eternal decrees. But that is, he writes, after all, precisely what the scriptures teach. Now, a management mind might look at this and think, well, everything you've told me is technically correct, but it's of absolutely no use to anyone. The word makes God seem like a cold, distant, authoritative deity. But when you add into some of his other traits, his his other aspects of his nature into his sovereignty. The fact that he is holy, the fact that he is all-powerful, the fact that he is all-knowing, that he is non-changing, that he is righteous, and of course that he is love, then his sovereignty makes more sense, and any hard edge to that word softens quite a bit. But make no mistake, God is sovereign, and he is the boss. Reminds me of the old saying that there are two things in life that we know for sure. There is a God, and that I or you are not him. Now, the older I get, the more comfort I really get from this understanding. Yes, along with so many other people right now, I might question God why he is allowing this virus to wreak havoc with people's lives, not just health-wise, but economically. And like I said, I have no good immediate answer to this, save for the fact that I find such a great comfort in knowing that God is in charge. He is the boss. And like I said just a moment ago, when I start to add in the other aspects of God's nature, again, his holiness, his power, his all-knowing, his non-changing, his innate righteousness, and of course his love, that's when my comfort level raises up quite a bit. In the passage from Romans, the apostle is looking back into history. He's particularly looking at Exodus chapter 33. In it, Moses is having a conversation with God, and the Lord answers him by saying, well, that he is free to do what he wants to do. He is free to deal with even a Moses as he sees fit. Now, think about Moses for a moment. Never before him, and really never since him, has there been a person more in need of divine reassurance than Moses. Confronting what seemed to be impossible odds and battling seemingly endless difficulties one after another, all he really wanted was a sense of divine presence and some indication that the Lord was really with them. So at one point in Exodus, he says, "Show me your glory." In fact, he demands that of God. And God, in replies like this. And I'm quoting a writer by the name of Lloyd Ogilvie. But he says this: "You have been willing more than any other man to do my will. You have run when other men would have fainted. And if ever there was a man who could dictate terms to God, it is you. But there never was such a man, and you must realize that blessing such as you have demanded is granted not on the basis of merit, but on the grounds of what I consider best. I grant graciously and mercifully what I choose to grant, and your demand is not granted." Paul then, in Romans chapter 9, goes on to refer to the extraordinary story of God's dealing with Pharaoh through Moses. And if you read it, the word hardening is used over and over again. Pharaoh is moved by these momentous events that overtake him, but only to backtrack, to revert once the effects wear off, to really an arrogant attitude of resistance to what God wants. Repeatedly, he hardens his heart until finally God seals it shut for him once and for all. This history of Pharaoh's hardened heart should be noted very carefully, as should the Lord's explanation of his actions. God says that he has raised up this man in order that his power may be made known. Now, some have said over the years that this passage from the Apostle Paul reads like God has used Pharaoh as a pawn in some cosmic chess game. That's a cold interpretation that I don't think is so much true. Now, I suppose it could be, because God is going to do what he's going to do, and he has every right to do whatever he wants to do. But this word raised up in Greek is related to a number of words that have a variety of meanings. It's a word that's used to describe Christ's resurrection. It can mean, like in James chapter 5, to cure. It can mean to establish a position, as in the case of John the Baptist, the prophet. It would appear in Pharaoh's case that God placed this man in a position of power so that when his own cold or hard-heartedness came into conflict with God's purpose, he would become this incredible illustration historically of the futility of really opposing the purposes of God. It's there for us in the Bible, for us to see, for us to acknowledge and to learn from. You see, God is the boss, and he will do what it takes, and perhaps who it takes to do the right thing always. And the right thing is what needs to be emphasized. And then continuing on in Paul's passage here, he's anticipating that people are not going to like this answer. He says, but who are you, O man, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to him who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for noble purposes and some for common use? And Paul basically is saying, wait, he's the boss. We are not. The pot has no right to tell the potter what to make and how to make his pot. But again, we need to pour in some of the other aspects of God's nature. And if we do that, can we not then trust that the boss knows best and will do what is best even if we cannot see it? The last few weeks have been very difficult for me to see beyond the week that I'm in, sometimes beyond the day that I'm in. And if you're like me, it's even been difficult to remember at times what day it is. But my vision is so narrow. God sees the big picture through time and space that we can't even begin to fathom. And I do know that God is holy. I do know that God is powerful. I do know that he is all-knowing. I do know that he is non-changing. I do know that by his basic nature, he is righteous. And of course, by his nature, he is love. And those aspects of who he is, I think, fill in the gaps, especially when we are in times of not knowing what is going on. We need to allow him and trust him to do what he's going to do and trust in his goodness all the way. I want to go back to Psalm 13 for a moment. At the end of it, David writes this. Well, at the beginning he writes, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I wrestle with my thoughts, every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fail. Like I said earlier, David is ticked off. He is angry. And he's asking the type of questions that many of us have been asking over the past 45 days or so. But again, does David get an easy or direct answer? No, but maybe yes. It's obvious that he writes those initial verses, lines, and then he stops and contemplates the nature of God, like I am asking us to do over the next 7 weeks. And then he writes this. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me. Why would he do that? Because he ultimately knows that God is the boss. He ultimately has experienced God's rescuing him in the past. He knows that God's plan, God's actions are bigger than him and ultimately would be good because God is the boss. And my apologies to the foot doctor, Bruce Springsteen, to engineers and managers out there and pastors like me who might be out there watching and listening to this. God is the boss and his nature is good. And let us join with David in singing to this boss because of his goodness.